Chapter 2, Blood and Tears. We are linked by blood, and blood is memory without language. Joyce Carol Oates. Indiana is famous for basketball, the Indy 500, cornfields, and oddly, HIV. Growing up in Indiana during the 1980s, I felt a kinship to one of the most famous Hoosiers in history. Ryan White and I were born within a day of each other in December 1971, and although our experiences growing up in Indiana were wildly different, our stories are linked by blood. Ryan White became a household name in the 80s when he fought hard for acceptance and the right to attend school after contracting HIV through blood transfusions intended to treat his hemophilia. Several years earlier, the Centers for Disease Control had reported the first few cases of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, among gay men. The next year, they reported the same immunodeficiency syndrome among Haitian refugees and people who inject drugs. Since modern safeguards weren't in place to protect the national blood supply, this beautiful expression of collective care became the source of heartache. Before anyone knew what was happening, 63% of people living with hemophilia, including Ryan White, had contracted HIV. Mass panic erupted over the rapidly spreading, fatal disease which had no effective treatment. Frightened people focused their fear on those who had contracted HIV, predominantly gay men, blaming and even harassing them in the process. Ryan White wasn't spared such mistreatment. Sometimes it was direct, as when customers on Ryan's newspaper route dropped their subscriptions or restaurants threw away dishes his family had eaten from. Someone even shot a bullet through a window of their home. At other times, it was indirect, as when the reporter and publisher of a paper that supported Ryan's right to attend school were harassed. Like most Americans, I followed Ryan White's ordeal as it played out on TV. My fellow Hoosiers' lack of compassion appalled me, but I was in awe of the grace with which Ryan managed the chaos. His insistence on being treated like a person instead of a disease forced people to confront their preconceived ideas about people living with HIV. It was clear he had done nothing wrong, and yet contracted a fatal disease some had claimed was God's punishment. I recognized that his innocence and contagious smile had cracked a hole in the wall that the public had erected to isolate people living with HIV. Through this opening, a scared and confused nation began to see them as sick people in needing of care instead of bad people deserving judgment. By the fall of 1987, when Ryan and I were both 15, he'd finally found a school to accept him in Cicero, Indiana. Meanwhile, I sat in a church about 2 hours away in New Albany, Indiana, listening to a guest speaker. I couldn't focus, though. Something was bothering me, both in my body and in my spirit. The ankle I had recently sprained playing basketball throbbed. For some reason, it was getting worse instead of better. But there was something else tugging at my attention. My heart began to ache with the longing for something I couldn't name. I was already pretty devout for my age, having grown up in a family that attended church whenever the doors were open, but I felt as though God was calling to me across time and space in a way that I had never experienced before. I didn't understand what he wanted me to do, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I made my way on crutches to the front of the church, where I prayed with my pastor and dedicated my life to this vague calling I couldn't name. I felt a sense of peace and confidence unlike anything I had ever experienced in my shy, awkward adolescent life. As we rode home, the pain and swelling in my ankle continued to worsen, and I noticed red dots on my arms and legs. Around my ankle, the dots merged, forming a large bruise. Later, while I was brushing my teeth, my gums began to bleed. A little freaked out, I showed all of this to my mom. My parents took me to an urgent care where my blood was drawn. A little later, the doctor stepped into the room, looking concerned. Her voice quivered as she explained I was bleeding because my platelets were too low to measure. Like Ryan White, I was in danger of bleeding to death and was rushed to the Children's Hospital in Louisville. After another blood draw, the nurse asked me to bend my arm to hold the little cotton ball in place. A few minutes later, when I straightened my arm, there was a lemon-sized swelling of blood under my skin. My mom gasped. My younger brother Brian, his eyes wide, grabbed Dad's arm and asked, "Is he going to die?" Everyone went silent. And that's when I got scared. I didn't understand why this was happening to me just a few hours after I had committed my life to serving God. The timing seemed significant, though, so I decided to pay close attention. The following days were filled with tests and tension. Even so, I enjoyed having the attention of all the doctors with their entourages of residents and students. Aside from the ache in my ankle and the pain of a bone marrow biopsy from my hip to rule out leukemia, I never really felt sick. This allowed me to follow along as the doctors methodically solved the mystery at work inside my body. The whole process fascinated me. They said I needed a series of transfusions to treat a condition called idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, ITP, and I was almost guaranteed a full recovery. The timing of my illness felt like more than a mere coincidence, and I decided right then and there that God was calling me to become a doctor. My admiration for Ryan White only deepened after my medical scare. He had spent his entire life dealing with the threat of painful bleeding joints and internal bleeding. I'd spent a weekend. He contracted HIV from a transfusion and faced terrible discrimination. My transfusion occurred a few years later when the blood supply was safe. He'd spent much of his life trying to convince everyone that he was just a normal teenage kid, but he wasn't. He changed the way people think and made the world a better place. Several months after Ryan died at 18 in 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Ryan White Care Act, establishing the national HIV healthcare system and guaranteeing access to compassionate treatment for anyone living with HIV. Later in that same decade, an unprecedented opioid epidemic began to churn beneath the surface. Much like the hidden existence of HIV in the national blood supply, the seriousness of the opioid crisis would take years to detect. Then, just as in Ryan's day, shared blood would again become the mechanism of misery. Almost 30 years from the day Ryan was diagnosed with HIV, I was there when these two great epidemics collided, as fate would have it, in Indiana. As I neared the end of high school, I knew my calling, but the road leading me there was harder than I ever expected. Education hadn't been a given in either my mom's or dad's families. My mom was only a few generations removed from squatters who'd migrated from Appalachia to the southern Indiana banks of the Ohio River. They had followed the hillbilly highway north to southern Indiana. Like generations before her, she ended up dropping out of school to get married at 16. In a desperate effort to escape the misery surrounding them, my dad voluntarily enlisted in the Air Force during the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, his job prospects were no better afterward. But when a stranger encouraged my mom to become a nurse, she decided to go back to school and, at the age of 24, become the first person in her family to graduate high school. That's when my dad's military service helped by enabling her to get her nursing degree at Indiana University Southeast, IUS, near my home. My dad decided to join her at IUS, pursuing a degree in art and psychology. I remember spending years of my childhood roaming the college campus. The beauty and inspiration I felt there stood in stark contrast to the darkness and desperation I'd witnessed in the homes of some of my extended family members who were still trapped in squalor. At that impressionable age, I already sensed a chasm separating people living with hope from those stuck in despair. These abstract feelings were etched on my mind through some of the monkeys my dad was studying in the psychology research lab. On the weekends, when it was his turn to care for the animals, he took me with him and let me help. I loved holding and feeding the monkeys, but I felt uncomfortable every time we entered the area where some of the baby monkeys were kept in isolation. Dad showed me that the students had set up fake mother figures to replace their real moms. Each monkey could choose a cold, hard wire frame with a bottle of milk attached to it, or a warm, soft cloth without a bottle. All of the baby monkeys preferred the cloth surrogate, choosing to visit the wire frame only to feed. The study they were doing with the baby monkeys demonstrated a basic need for connection that existed separately from the need for food. My dad told me the baby monkeys put in a test room without their cloth would just huddle in a corner and whimper. The babies that had their cloth would playfully explore the area, periodically returning to the cloth to cuddle. However, the baby monkeys were still missing something fundamental to becoming healthy by missing the nurture of their real mom. Dad told me these baby monkeys that bonded to the inanimate surrogates remained neurotic and had difficulty socializing with other monkeys. Once I began to practice medicine, I thought about those monkeys when meeting a patient who seemed stuck in despair and unable to avoid making one disastrous decision after another. To what lengths will people go to get a sense of belonging and gratification when they were denied those basic human needs from a very young age? Despite my parents' example, I knew college would be no easy task. I'd grown up with one foot in a world inherited from generations of Appalachian poverty, and one foot in the strange new world of possibilities my parents introduced me to while they attended college. Frankly, I didn't feel like I fit into either. After high school, the combination of a Pell Grant, awarded to low-income students, a music scholarship, and the financial assistance I received as a dependent of a veteran allowed me to enroll in college. Even though I attended the same university I had explored as a child, Indiana University Southeast, I felt out of place among the students from wealthier families. I went to my classes but didn't understand how to take notes or prepare for exams, so I struggled for the first 2 years. I joined study groups and learned as much as I could from my classmates raised in a higher socioeconomic class, and in time, my grades improved. When I first applied to medical school, however, I was turned down. Undeterred, I moved to Indianapolis with my new wife, Leah, to improve my chances by completing a master's program in biology. After several more failed attempts to get into medical school, I began to question the calling I had felt at 15. But having watched my parents overcome even greater obstacles, I refused to give up. Leah and I moved overseas, where I was able to complete the first 2 years of medical school. When I scored near the top nationally on the medical licensing exam, the seemingly impossible happened, and I was accepted to Indiana University School of Medicine as a third-year transfer student. Even though I had accepted a loan that stipulated I would provide primary care in an underserved community in Indiana, my professors kept trying to recruit me into specialty fields like cardiology and surgery. One day as we were finishing up rounds, our surgery attending physician said, "Cooke, I'd like to talk to you." My anxiety soared, and a couple of my classmates glanced my way with pity. Surgeons are notorious for making medical students do grunt work. "I understand you're planning to go into primary care," he said, cocking his head slightly. "Yes, sir," I answered. "Why on earth would you do that?" he blurted out. I paused for a second and explained, "I believe it's my calling. I really want to make a difference in an underserved community." "You need to reconsider," he urged. "You've got a lot of potential. It would be a shame for you to throw all that away in primary care." I was shocked to hear him say that, but I held my tongue. "Look," he said, pointing out a large window that overlooked the campus. A gentle snow was falling, though the grass was still green. Beyond the snowflakes were another dance of white, students, residents, and attendings wearing lab coats of varying lengths, which signified their level of training, moving along the sidewalk as far as I could see. "This institution is the heart and soul of medicine. Every single patient here is being cared for by a specialist. All primary care docs do is just hand us their patients." He turned to face me again. "The only way you'll ever make a difference is if you specialize. Otherwise, you'll spend your career as nothing more than a gatekeeper." He pointed out the window again. "For them." He paused and let that sink in, then added more sincerely, "And that would be a shame." While I didn't doubt my commitment to practice primary care medicine in an underserved community, the conversation with the surgeon left me feeling discouraged as I headed home. By this time, Leah and I had a 2-year-old son, Eli. After dinner, I got Eli ready for bed and carried him over to his bedroom window. The moon was big and bright. Its silver light reflected off the white snow that now covered everything. "Where's the moon?" I asked. Eli pointed up with wonder in his eyes. "That's right," I said. I kissed his cheek and lay next to him in bed. I stroked his head and sang to him until he was asleep. As his breathing slowed, I felt my exhausted body relax. But once I softly closed his door behind me and made my way down the hall, I felt a familiar tension rise within me. Things with my wife had not been going well. Our time together had been cut up into tiny pieces around my training, and we fought a lot. In April 2001, only a month before I graduated with honors from IU School of Medicine, Leah gave birth to our second child, a daughter whom we named Moira. Leah and I hoped the end of medical school and the birth of Moira would mark a new beginning for us. And although I'd been concerned about dividing my love between two children, I discovered love has a funny sort of math that allows the heart to somehow love each without that love being diminished or diluted. During my residency, I spent time caring for patients in resource-poor areas of Ecuador. I made sure my training included C-sections and significant experience in the emergency department. By the time I completed my residency, I felt fully prepared to move to a rural area and offer a broad range of services to the community. Shortly before I finished my training, I began searching for a place God would be able to use me most. I was struck by how much deprivation I found across Appalachia and the Midwest. I could practically throw a dart at a map and land on a community in need. But because I had signed a commitment to practice in a rural area of Indiana, I decided to narrow my search to rural areas within driving distance of my parents, who still lived in my hometown of New Albany. I liked the idea of my kids growing up near their grandparents. After exploring several options and spending a lot of time in prayerful contemplation, I signed a recruitment agreement with Scott Memorial Hospital in Scottsburg to establish and maintain an independent primary care clinic in Austin for the next 5 years. In exchange, they agreed to offset any shortages in my overhead for 18 months. I named my clinic Foundations Family Medicine, based on my belief that good health is the foundation of a full and purposeful life. A healthy individual is the foundation of a healthy family, and a healthy family is the foundation of a healthy community. I drew a tree with deep roots as my logo to represent my personal commitment to the community, and as a Christian, I adopted Jesus' explanation about why he came to earth, that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. Of course, there was a lot more to opening a practice than I imagined. While my new building just a mile from Main Street was under construction, I had to pick out and purchase an electronic medical record, computers, office equipment, furniture, desks, phone system, internet provider, malpractice insurance, business insurance, and health insurance for my employees, set up retirement plans, payroll, and bank accounts, get enrolled in all the insurance plans, get credentialed at the hospital, order supplies, make arrangements for medical waste disposal, garbage disposal, janitorial services, landscaping, advertising, and set up inspections for the state and fire marshal. It's no wonder fewer than 1 in 5 doctors operate a solo practice, let alone one in a poverty-stricken, resource-poor place in the middle of rural Indiana. I brought my 2 kids to the worksite a few times a week to watch as the building went up. Once completed, the facility would be roughly 1,500 square feet with 3 exam rooms, a procedure room, and a small waiting room. Attached to it, duplex style, would be a mirror set of offices and exam rooms I hoped would attract visiting services to help me meet the needs of the community. The sounds of hammers and men calling to each other, mixed with the nostalgic smell of fresh-cut lumber, transported me back to my childhood when my dad took me with him when we helped my Grandpa Lames, a carpenter, on job sites. Grandpa's parents had moved to Indiana from Owsley County, Kentucky, one of the nation's poorest counties. Grandpa Lames was a stern man who'd inherited generations of toxic family drama and poverty. With only an elementary school education, he relied on his carpentry skills to get by. But he also turned to alcohol and opioids to cope with the difficulties of life. When intoxicated, he would fly into fits of rage, so my mom's earliest memories were of crawling under her bed to hide from her own dad. Though all her siblings drank from stray bottles left around the house when they were young, Mom realized that heavy drinking would keep her from improving her own life. Thanks to some positive outside influences and stubborn persistence, my parents were able to escape the generations of trauma and dysfunction around them. Yet they didn't turn their backs on where they'd come from, teaching my brother and me that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. That included family members like my Grandpa Lames, who were the hardest to love. Watching Eli and Moira play hide and seek at the construction site of my new office made me thankful my brother and I had been raised in a stable, loving home. I quietly prayed not only that I'd be able to provide them the same blessing, but that this new building would be a place where I could help families in Austin do the same. By September 2004, everything was in place to start seeing patients. While I would have preferred to have a staff of 4 or 5, I could afford to hire only a biller receptionist and a nurse, far from ideal, but still more than the people of Austin had had access to in decades. As the opening of the clinic neared, the idea of practicing medicine by myself in such a poverty-stricken and resource-poor area was intimidating. On the other hand, I was captivated by the way Austin reflected the quintessential American town Norman Rockwell captured in his art, some of which I hung on my clinic walls. I was also confident that God had called me here and that I could truly make a difference in this community. Of course, it helped that Scott Memorial Hospital had pledged 18 months of financial support. The day I opened my practice was terrifying. After feeling God's call to become a doctor at 15, I had spent the next 18 years preparing for this one moment. I unlocked the doors and called my 2 employees, Elizabeth and Amy, to the center of the waiting room, where we held hands and prayed, thanking God for allowing us to serve Him and asking for His guidance. We had no idea if anyone would even show up that day. But a few minutes later, my receptionist biller welcomed our first patient, and we were off. Some of the people we took care of had never seen a doctor before. One 60-something man had a tumor on his tongue so large he carried a handkerchief with him to catch the saliva that dripped from the corner of his mouth. It was difficult to imagine why he'd waited so long to visit a doctor while living with a disfigurement that so severely disrupted his quality of life and social interactions. The following year, however, I ran across a study from the National Institute of Health reporting that if someone from a rural area simply had a driver's license, they were at least twice as likely to visit a doctor as someone without one. Since my patient lacked both transportation and insurance, walking to my office was the first opportunity he'd had to see a healthcare provider in years. In just a few months, I diagnosed patient after patient with late-stage manifestations of chronic diseases. Some were diabetics who had never been diagnosed, let alone treated, and who were already experiencing loss of feeling in their feet and partial blindness. They had been left out of advances in medical screening and treatment because of where they lived and how they were viewed. Perhaps the most disheartening cases, however, were the young women I diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. Week after week, women of all ages would come see me, having never had a pap smear because they'd lacked access to medical care. Most of them turned out to be treatable, but even one pointless death was too many. I'm still haunted by the memory of the first time I had to tell a family that their 38-year-old, otherwise healthy loved one was dying of advanced cervical cancer, a disease that should have been prevented, and I had to deliver this awful news to more than one woman who had thought she was healthy. Each time it became more difficult because of the inconsolable reactions, pointless suffering, and untimely deaths I'd already witnessed. Cervical cancer was the leading cause of death among women in the 1900s, but this was the 21st century when simple access to modern screening and prevention could virtually eliminate the risk of anyone dying of cervical cancer. Nonetheless, a flawed system had harmed the people of Austin and needlessly shortened lives. I marveled how conditions here in the heart of the richest country on earth rivaled those I saw on mission trips to developing countries. When I shared my concerns with otherwise compassionate people within the community, their reactions shocked me. They dismissed the harms inflicted on my patients as natural consequences of their personal failings. The consensus was that my patients were paying the penalty for their laziness, promiscuity, bad choices, and ignorance. But that didn't sit well with me. After all, these people hadn't created their circumstances had created them. I was reminded of the prevailing attitude in the Baptist church in which I grew up. Our preacher, a native of eastern Kentucky, preached a fire and brimstone gospel transplanted from Appalachia. Our small congregation was close-knit and felt like family. Yet we were implicitly taught that sickness and suffering were the consequences of refusing to live by the right morals and rules. When I was a teenager, my dad was even chided for bringing friends of mine to church dressed in t-shirts and shorts, the only clothes they had. My dad didn't mince words, telling his fellow deacons to get over it. Christ wouldn't be trying to keep those kids out of church. They need to feel safe here, so stop being judgmental. The matter was quickly dropped, but I never forgot my dad's willingness to stand up for my friends. I wanted to show that same care to the people in my new town. Witnessing the tragedy of innocent people being blamed for dying young caused me to question the prevailing emphasis of my upbringing and medical training on personal responsibility. Harshly judging people whose fate had been sealed in childhood before they made any of their own choices reminded me of Ryan White's experience. Inspired by his example and my dad's insights into Christ's love for and acceptance of others, I began to contemplate society's moral obligation to ensure all people have equal access to health, opportunity, and above all, life. The work in Haiti of one of my personal heroes, Dr. Paul Farmer, encouraged me that a doctor could impact the health of individuals by partnering with the community to ensure that a person's social status never denied them access to the benefits of scientific and social progress. A system that harms people in this way, he said, inflicts structural violence. Violence because it harms people, structural because it's embedded in our cultural, political, and economic systems. I realized the biggest obstacle to prevent the poor in Austin from achieving their full potential, physically, mentally, and spiritually, was their lack of such basics as nutrition, shelter, safety, and connection. For that reason, I couldn't focus only on bringing basic services like prenatal care, immunizations, and cancer screening, while ignoring the social structures that determined a person's health. The thing that nagged at my heart the most was the realization that by allowing these disparities to continue, we were defining whose lives mattered and whose did not.